Hello, my name is Shirgi, and in this video I'll be showing you how I orchestrate a beautiful, serene sound, something that sounds maybe a little bit painful and nostalgic. For this exercise, I'll be using a melody that I wrote almost a year ago now. I'll be guiding you through my thought process to orchestrate this part for a full orchestra, and I hope that you learn something from me. First, let's see what we have to start. I've written down the melodies here in various instruments, so I have flute, oboe, and clarinet. These may or may not be final. We'll see what I think later on. I just put them here in the woodwinds because the woodwinds are excellent melody instruments. They're very, very expressive, especially because we want that nice serene sound. I would say the flute's middle range is around what this melody is playing. I would say the oboe's middle range is around what it's playing right here. And the clarinet doesn't really sound good in its middle range compared to the extreme ranges of the clarinet, so here I just chose to put it in the upper range of the clarinet. The clarinet also sounds quite sweet and nice in its lower range, but for this melody specifically, I hope you'll see that it's much better in the higher range of the clarinet than the lower one. I've sketched out the chords here in the pipe organ. The pipe organ won't stay in the final result. This is just to imitate the sound of a full orchestra. Let's listen to what this piece sounds like with the organ playing the chords and then some of the woodwinds playing the melodies. I think this melody needs to start very solemn sounding in the beginning of the phrase and then gradually build up to a very climactic but very heartbreaking and very aching sounding crescendo. I want a heavy, very emotional and expressive climax here. I don't want it to be too bombastic. I need it to be a little bit restrained. There are a million and one ways to go about orchestrating a feeling. I know that's not very helpful for me to say, but I hope it's at least somewhat encouraging and that you know that there are multiple ways for you to explore expressing yourself without having to resort to any what I guess you could call orchestral cliches. Nevertheless, I think I'm going to submit to some of those cliches soon, but we'll see what happens. Let's make a mental note of how our orchestration is going to develop. At the beginning here, I kind of want a very lonely and a very saddening kind of sound. In order to achieve this, I think I'm going to make use of mostly woodwind harmony. Woodwind harmony, I believe, is very close and personal sounding, and it's not quite as round and full as chords in the brass or the strings are, so it's perfect for this kind of lonely sound that we want at the beginning. Right after that, before the key change, I think here it needs to develop into a bigger and grander sound, so I think here I'll introduce the strings, maybe a little bit of brass, but not too much because I want to save the brass for the part after this with the key change. Right here I want a full orchestra playing this climactic part here. I must be careful here though because I can't just put notes to build chords in every instrument. I need to specifically emphasize that sweet and smooth sound that I want. So that means, for example, I can't have the brass play too involved because I don't think the brass would evoke that very sweet and nostalgic sound that we want, at least for the melody that I've written. For other melodies and perhaps your melodies, the brass would be excellent at playing that sort of stuff, especially I think a nice high trombone or also a beautiful horn solo. I don't have this instrument here, but the euphonium is also excellent at playing those nice, wonderful, smooth melodies. The trumpet, not so much. The cornet, though, beautiful. But if you want to write a beautiful, nostalgic sounding brass melody, I think horn and cornet are your top choices. For me though, I think I'm gonna go with a combination of woodwinds and also the strings. And before you comment on how I modulated from 4 sharps to 4 flats, don't worry about it. I'm not gonna go too much into the theory behind these chords here. I hope that just by listening to them, you heard that this transition is smooth enough and sounds okay. You can peep the chords here if you really care to figure it out. So let's start by putting our harmony in the woodwinds like we discussed. We could have, for example, oboes and bassoons playing these chords, which I think are a beautiful combination. They have that nice, warm, double reed sound that I really love. It's a little bit rough maybe if you hear any of the instruments on their own, but when put together, it sounds like a wonderful human voice choir almost, especially when compared to a choir for, say, clarinets. I also advocate for a clarinet and bassoon harmony. That kind of chorale instrumentation is also very beautiful. Clarinet and bassoon harmony is clearer sounding than bassoon and oboe harmony. This is because the clarinet, well, that's how it gets its name, right? The clarinet has a much clearer sound. When clarinets blend with other instruments, they tend to round off and polish the sound of those other instruments. In a way, this can be both good and bad. It really depends on what the sound that you want. I know it doesn't do no good for me to just explain it to you. You really want to listen to it. So let me put this melody here in the clarinet and oboe and clarinet and bassoon. First, let's listen to oboe only play this melody. Now let's listen to that same melody in oboe and clarinet playing together. Now let's listen to this melody in bassoon and then clarinet and bassoon. I think I am going to put the harmony in 2 bassoons and 2 oboes. The main melody is being played by the flute, and I would say that the flute and the oboe have pretty dissimilar tone qualities. That's why I've written the counter melody in the oboe here, and I've written the main melody in the flute, because those 2 instruments are quite different from each other, so it makes a good melody and counterpoint distinction. However, I think it would be even more effective if we move this melody to a clarinet. And, a clarinet sounds more similar to a flute than a flute sounds similar to an oboe. So although perhaps the big distinction between the counter melody and the melody will be a little bit diminished, I think the distinction between the melody and the harmony accompaniment will be even greater and will sound beautiful. Now, because I'm very lazy and I've already written out the chords here in the organ, I'm just going to steal them from here and move them to these instruments. So what I've done here is that I've taken the notes straight from the organ chords, which might be perhaps a piano reduction for you if you're composing for a full orchestra, and I've put them into 2 oboes and 2 bassoons. Let's listen to what this short phrase sounds like. Just for comparison, let's put these same chords in the clarinets and bassoons instead. I hope you could hear that clarinets make the harmonies sound much smoother than if they were in the oboes. Now I've put everyone back into my preferred arrangement, so let's move on to the next part here. Here I want the woodwind harmony to continue, but like we discussed earlier, I want the strings to come in and help out. The strings will lay a beautiful foundation for the chords, and instead of overpowering the woodwinds, the strings should just help them out and make them sound a little bit more open and a little bit more strong. So now I've just extended the chords that I took from the organ again and put them into my harmony instruments. And now let's see, how exactly are we going to let the strings help out the woodwinds? We could just have the strings play the same chords as they are, but I actually advise against this. The reason is because the string section is so much bigger than the woodwind section. If we have the strings play the same notes as the woodwinds, they will greatly overpower the woodwinds. You could perhaps put the strings at a lower volume than the woodwinds, for example, woodwinds at piano and strings at pianissimo. However, I still don't think that's quite good, unless it's the big climactic moment, which we will write, but unless it is that big climactic moment, it's going to sound maybe a little bit too murky. The strings need to lay the foundation but give the woodwinds their space. In order to achieve this, we're just going to have the strings play what I like to call the fundamental notes of the chord. There are two fundamental notes of a chord, the root note and the fifth. So let's write out the fundamental notes of these chords. I will leave in me writing these chords so you can hear my thought process as I talk to myself writing out these chords. We're in the key of E major here, like I've marked. I've written here a major 2 chord. The second degree of E major is F sharp. F sharp major has the fundamental notes of F sharp and C sharp. So I will be writing down F sharp and C sharp in these instruments here. I could put the cello all the way down here. I think I'd prefer it to be up here. It's a little sweeter up here in this range than in this lower range. And I'm actually going to have the first and second violins play the same thing, just for simplicity. So we have kind of a 3-part, I don't even know if I can call it harmony, just 3-part stuff going on. Next here we have a 5 chord, which is nice and simple. It's E major, so the 5 chord is B major. B major has the fundamental notes of B and F sharp. We already have an F sharp here from our F sharp major chord, so I'm just going to continue this F sharp over here. This C will move down to B, and you guys are going to stay at F sharp. Next we have a G sharp minor chord, which is nice and simple. Its fundamental notes are G sharp and D sharp. I will have these F sharps move to G sharp, and this B can move up to D sharp. Next we have a diminished 2 chord here, so the second scale degree of G sharp minor is A sharp, so we have an A sharp diminished chord here, and the fundamental notes of A sharp diminished are A sharp and E natural. So I'll have E natural here and y'all, whoopsies, and what's that? We need A sharp here. Now for the last 2 chords of this phrase, we have a minor 4 chord, 4 in G sharp minor. That should be scale degree 4 of G sharp minor is C sharp. So we have a C sharp minor chord here. The fundamental notes of C sharp minor are C sharp and G sharp. I will have you move up to G sharp, and you can move up to C sharp. And then finally, the 5 chord of G sharp minor, that should be D sharp major. The fundamental notes of D sharp major are D sharp and A sharp. I will have you guys move down to D sharp, and you can move down to A sharp. Finally, I'll put y'all in the piano dynamic, and let's hear what these guys all sound like together. Now, I can hear that the clarinet's getting a little weak here, and that's because, like I said earlier, the clarinet is kind of weak in this middler range. Unfortunately, that's just how the clarinet is, so we can either put this in a different instrument or raise the volume of this. I think raising the volume of an instrument that's already in its weak range is just asking for trouble. I think it would be much better if we put you in a different instrument. I think perhaps we can try using an English horn to play this part. The English horn sound will contrast nicely with this main melody flute here. It will blend a little bit with this oboe and bassoon harmony we have here, but I'm not too concerned about that because this English horn is of course playing forte over all these guys. English horn stands out beautifully from the rest of the orchestra. It doesn't sound too weak like it did in that clarinet. Now you'll notice here that I actually left a spot open for the contrabass, and this is mostly because I want the contrabass to come in at the key change here. By holding off the bass and saving it for later, the bass gains a lot more dramatic effect. So, you know, it's an orchestral bass drop, I suppose. That means the bass notes are still being played mostly by this bassoon here. Notice that the bassoon is playing still lower than the cellos. I think here we could perhaps reinforce this wonderful bassoon with a tuba. It is going to have to be quite a quiet tuba though, because the tuba is extremely resonant and very loud. So while the rest of the harmony is playing at piano, I will have the tuba play at pianissimo. So it'll still help out this wonderful bass here. It'll reinforce the bassoon. It is playing the same notes as the bassoon. So it'll reinforce that bassoon, make it just a tiny bit louder. So let's listen first without the tuba. Now let's add in the tuba. I wanted to have a very grand sounding orchestral build up here. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to add a crescendo of all of these instruments. They're all going to go to forte, including the strings down here. And the tuba, like I said, it's very, very loud, so I'm not going to move it to forte. It can go to mezzo forte. Now, as you could hear there, the English horn is getting very buried underneath all of these other instruments. So what can we do about this? So to reinforce this English horn melody, which is getting a little bit lost in this forte crescendo here, I've also put in a horn that is a brass instrument, so it should stand out very nicely from the rest of the orchestra and be able to play over even the loud woodwinds and the loud strings. I want that transition from English horn to French horn to be a little bit more subtle though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you become forte a little bit later, and I'll start you out at piano so that you kind of fade in when you blend in with the other English horn here. Now let's talk about orchestrating this beautiful climactic part here. I want this melody to be played by strings because, well, who's going to deny a beautiful sad sun and string melody, huh? I hope it kind of goes without saying here that putting this wonderful melody in the violins will evoke that very saddening and painful kind of sound that we want. In fact, I like it so much, I'm going to put it in both violins. I want this melody to sound a little brighter than that though, and I could, for example, move the first violins up an octave and keep the second violins down here, which is possible, I suppose. I think it's much more practical for your players and also for your orchestration if you just use a woodwind instrument to play those high notes. And, well, what instrument can even play that high? Well, you, piccolo. Sometimes it's a little contentious if the composer's writing sucks or your player sucks. I'm not gonna lie, I think I'm gonna argue here that if your piccolo is just plays this out of tune, that's not my fault. The piccolo is just really putting like those musical sprinkles on top of the sweet, sweet violin sounds. Now it's time for the rest of the chords. I think here that I want a very dense and beautiful string harmony. We have to be a little bit careful here because if you put the strings close together, then you can't really put the rest of the orchestra too close together in a harmony because the strings will kind of muddy up the sound of the other instruments. It would be better here if we did kind of the opposite of what we did before, where we had the woodwinds playing this nice close harmony, and then we had the strings playing just the fundamental notes. I think in this key change here, we'll have the woodwinds and the brass playing the fundamental notes, and then have the strings play all of the close harmonies that we like. So once again, I'm going to be lazy and just put the harmony from the organ onto you. Now, I hope you heard as we're moving from here to the key change, something feels like it's lost, and it's because, well, the woodwinds go away. I want here for the woodwind harmony to continue, but like I said, since all of these guys are already playing the close harmonies, I want the woodwinds to just play the fundamental notes. So now let's listen to what all of these guys sound like together. Some of these melodies here I think are a little too weak. I'm going to boost these clarinets up to fortissimo and add the other clarinet playing this melody so it should be nice and loud. I will also boost these guys up to fortissimo. Now the melody should be even clearer. Usually I like to think there are no hard and fast rules about music, but if I was to pick one, that would definitely be one of them. Make sure your melody is easily heard over your harmony. That is of the utmost importance. Now let's also include the brass harmony. The woodwinds are already playing the fundamental notes, so I'm just going to be super lazy. All right, let's hear what that sounds like. Okay, adding those brass instruments really added to that kind of all the stops out pipe organs kind of sound. I think though that these brass instruments need to be even quieter. Let's not put you at piano, but I'll put you at mezzo piano. I think these strings could sound a little fuller, so I think I'm gonna have you guys play in thirds. Because there are more notes playing than just one single melody, now these melody lines are going to sound even thicker. We just have to make sure that they align with the chords that we're playing, otherwise it's going to sound a little strange. So this F note here is not a note in the A flat major chord here that we have, so I'm going to move that down to E. I think the best thing to do is just to listen and then try and spot any notes that sound kind of off. Now, I've just noticed here that the slurs that I have here are not exactly for string instruments. Writing slurs for woodwinds, piano, brass instruments, strings, they're all kind of different, especially for strings, because strings, when they have slurs, it usually implies that you're to play that string of notes using the same bow stroke. But of course, the way we had it here before, having all of these notes be played by the same bow stroke doesn't seem very practical. I've actually written in so many less slurs here than there were before. I kind of want here, imagine every note that isn't slurred here to be played with alternating bow strokes, right, up and down. By having them switch their bow strokes more often, it gives each note a more powerful sound. Also notice here that there's like a big gap here. This probably isn't like a huge problem, but like just for me, I like to have just a little rest here, just so that this big jump here isn't too jarring, and you give your string players just a little bit of rest there before they can jump to that note. Now here in the original, I did mark for these guys to be decrescendo, for this melody to kind of fade away. Let's hear what that sounds like if I add decrescendo to every instrument. That sounds okay, but I think we can do better than that. How do we do a better decrescendo than that? Here's a fun little trick. Instead of having everyone decrescendo at the same time, what you can do to have a lighter and more graceful decrescendo, I would say, is to have the lower notes of the entire orchestra stop playing first, and then have the higher notes of the orchestra be the last notes to be heard of the chord. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the contrabass off, like right there. It's just going to stop playing. Same with the tuba, and also this low horn here, and also the bassoon. So all of those low notes are now just gone. So these cello notes are going to get real short, and then let's also have the trombones here get quite short, this bassoon here, and now all together it sounds like this. There you go. Doesn't that just sound more graceful of a lift, easier on the ears, I think, than a full decrescendo of every instrument? Now for this last part here, I want these chords to be very kind of fluttery, so I'm going to put them in the woodwinds. So to start off here, I've put them in oboes and English horn. That's not exactly what I want. I want this to be even smoother, or the oboes, of course, do have a very warm sound, but it's not exactly the tone quality that I'm looking for. Instead, I'm actually going to move this melody to an oboe and then swap you guys out for clarinets. I'll also put this guy in bassoon. Has a richer tone than the oboes and the English horn, I think. Let's take this bass line here and put it in this bassoon here. That's very pretty. I want this bass note to be emphasized here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that wonderful A flat major in the strings. I will also have the brass here. They will play the fundamental notes of the chord like we discussed earlier. Now let's hear what that ending part sounds like. I also noticed here that I haven't really done a whole lot with these upper horns. So there you go. You guys just get to play the same thing because I'm so creative. During this build-up here, I think I want more of the brass instruments to come in. So I'm a very good composer and I know exactly what I'm doing. I would never resort to such cheap techniques like copy and paste. Now let's listen to what this sounds like all together. Okay, so that's what this sounds like after, what, an hour of orchestration? Now, of course, this orchestration isn't perfect. I think maybe it's a little bit rough around the edges. I'm not sure if I would call this completely done. I hope you learned something about instruments, how to put them together, and some general principles of arranging music for a full orchestra. Do notice that I haven't included any percussion, and I included this contrabass in here, but I didn't actually use it. There's no need to just use every instrument because you have it, unless you're Mahler. But I'm not Mahler, look at me. I'm like a fox-eared composer writing music for the internet. So I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed my orchestration tutorial. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask me. I'm 100% sure that I've left out something here that maybe would be an obvious question for me to have answered. If you like my orchestration tutorial, then please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys later. Bye bye! These instruments might not be final. I just put them here because I don't know. Assuming that the root note and the first, I'm gonna move this melody to